Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Subscription Radio, coming to you live from the internet. With me again, I have my good buddy Ben Kochavy. I'm always gonna, really
It's okay. It's just
talented
Ben squared.
Ben Squared. Yeah, you guys are riding with Ben Squared today. Ben runs a growth agency, works with direct-to-consumer brands and brands that would not consider themselves direct-to-consumer. He's a professional problem solver around all things growth. So, Ben, thanks for coming back on the show. It's been a really long time since I last saw you.
Long time listener, second time caller. It's a fun experience.
um, so, what we talking about was recently Joel and I discussed from the engineer's point of view the trade-offs around buying versus building. That's really hot right now, especially because of Headless. You have, on one hand, you have these platforms, whether it's Shopify, BigCommerce, Magento, WooCommerce, whatever. You have those platforms that have made it really easy to start selling online. And then over the last few years, what has happened is we'll call it a lot of brands, especially we'll call it more mature brands, have wanted increasingly more control over the front end customer experience. And especially within D2C, where a big part of the differentiation of between your competitors, as well as just differentiating from like the Amazon experience, is around providing a great customer experience. You want more control, whether that's control over the checkout process, the customer experience, the onboarding. And so oftentimes brands will find that the only way to accomplish what they want or what they had envisioned was to build it all themselves. And so I think that's an interesting conversation for us to have where as someone who's been both an operator as well as a advisor to a lot of these brands and a growth marketer, like, can you talk a little bit around what goes through your head of when deciding to buy versus build, and can you give us some specific examples of when it worked out well or it didn't, and how maybe your thought process has matured?
Yeah, definitely. I guess uh, it's kind of this escalation of that conversation of Shopify Plus versus Shopify Headless, right? If you have to make that trade-off, that same trade-off, or not same, but very similar trade-off gets done in the general like buy versus build. I've worked in organizations which are like founders are both engineers, so the solution to everything is build. It's never buy because they wanted to engineer, and good for them. Been in other organizations where it's like a middle ground, product led, and other organizations that is marketing led, and kind of a lot of it becomes a lot of it's affected by the organizational tone in terms of the way the organization operates and thinks about running a business affects how they make these decisions. But then on the other side, from a growth perspective, the way I look at it is agility is I think agility is the ultimate goal when you're doing growth. You want to be able to pivot and change little pieces of the experience, large pieces of the experience as fast as possible. Whatever lets you do that best is the right answer. But that becomes the problem of context with individual brands. Agility, if you have an army of 50 developers at your beck and call to just work on your problems, then sure, they should custom build it because that experience will be much better, much faster, much like the ultimate possible result. But then on the other side, if you're a small brand and you have one developer who has to keep the whole thing running on top of your experiments and tests, it's much better for you to tack on a Shopify app to test the functionality, even if it's not the perfect experience, to get you to that point of, okay, now you're doing, for example, SMS is a great example. I work with a brand that has to like use developers to integrate everything. So they integrated MailChimp. They now have this thing where they want to integrate Klaviyo, but they can't because it's going to cost them $50,000 and they need the devs to do something first. And then on the other side of it, they haven't even hit SMS yet as adding it as a marketing channel because the same level of integration that you have to do for Klaviyo, you have to do for SMS to do it well. And so it's like you get hit against the priority problem and then like a, not cash flow, but like resourcing problem, right? in a situation where you don't have unlimited cash or unlimited resources, you start to make trade-offs. And I think for growth people, at least in my experience, the agility slash momentum above all else will get you very far. But then if you don't have the developers to support, you got to build it, you got to buy it and then customize to the best that you can without the developer support, because they're probably prioritized against other key projects that are driving like bottom line revenue, right? That's kind of how organizations operate. So one example, worked with a fashion brand, men's fashion brand. They're selling curated underwear to men. The whole tech stack is built on, I believe it's called Spree. And it's all custom, right? They need a dev to do basically anything. They have a really custom experience. They have an amazing way of cataloging the different types of fashion they have, understanding people's fashion tastes, and then selecting for them products at a level that's probably more sophisticated than your average like online quiz that you see from D2C brands, because they actually have to understand and respond to style, and they can't just do if this then that for 2 or 3 selections. So they got pretty deep in there, but as a result, they can't pivot on anything. Anything becomes a feature build. It's like 3 weeks, QA, bugs. You have to make sure everything's working. Can't optimize. Checkout goes down. You have issues. All that stuff's custom built. And I mean, custom isn't always bad, but if you're moving very quickly, custom can be bad, because the pressure of like get to the next thing to build means the developer doesn't have the time and attention to get to the completely bugless version of something because it was just built yesterday. I mean, that might be like a weird way to look at development work. I'm not a developer, but from the growth side, it becomes like the friction that we're dealing with is like, okay, a 3-week thing that I could do in 5 minutes by installing a Shopify app and clicking some settings is pretty frustrating. Slows down your growth. But on the other side, they have probably one of the better like style assessments in that space in terms of like understanding people's actual taste and serving it efficiently, understanding the dynamics of like, it's a curated subscription where they're actually telling you what you're going to get before you get it, and then you can change what you're getting and still managing inventory against that, right? There's a lot of problems to be solved in there, and they managed to solve it with this custom build. So they solved the big problem, but they're now no longer agile, but that's fine if you're big and you have like a dev army. They just don't. So that's like an interesting situation to be in. On the other side of it, right? Mattress company I worked with, they sell direct to consumer mattresses. They have a few brands. Some of them are all in a home built solution. Dev team built it, works amazing. It's been optimized a million ways to Sunday to generate sales efficiently for that exact brand and their family of brands. And then what ended up happening is, in order to be agile to test new things, we needed to go off product, because I was essentially in charge of a new brand that didn't have the scale of some of the other brands in the portfolio. So priorities were always would always go to the big brands that were generating money, right? 20 hours of dev work generates an extra $1 million is different than 20 hours of dev work gets me an extra few sales that might generate millions of dollars 6 months from now. So that was a lot of trade-offs there. It was just easier to be agile on a like off-the-shelf Shopify Plus platform, add in an app whenever I wanted, could get a lot done. That's like a wall of an answer to your question. A lot of opinions and assumptions and 1,000 things in there, but happy to talk about it.
And let's unpack parts of that, because I made some mental notes. Let's see if I can remember them all. I think I have a couple questions to ask before I ask the questions that I'm really thinking, in part because there's a lot of assumptions that I have around the way brands operate, and even just like what they value. And some of this might not even reflect maybe the types of brands that you work with or have any sort of insight into their rationale. But as an engineer and as an entrepreneur, I guess a few things that come to mind that I've thought about a lot is, one of which is the agility argument makes a lot of sense to me. And it seems like there's like certain circumstances where the answer is obvious. If you're a small early stage company Yes, and yes, you need to be agile. Yes, you don't have many resources. Yes, there's a high likelihood that you're just going to be building stuff and throwing it away. You should just be starting from a platform like Shopify. Maybe at most you invest in building some custom app functionality. Um, but the pros and cons of building your own thing, or even let's call it the risks and the costs of what goes wrong if you choose Shopify versus what goes wrong if you decide to do a build, is completely different economics. Because what I've seen happen is that if you're a new brand and you decide to build, the problem is that you might not ever launch. You might burn all of your money engineering. Because I think for a company that has engineers, or a brand to have engineers, comes a lot down to its culture, I would suspect. Because when I think of a D2C brand, I often think of marketers and we'll call it non-technical people who have an audience, who have expertise around branding, positioning, maybe supply chain. They're not a software company. Like, this goes back to me, like, WeWork was not a software company, yet it tried to get software multiples, right? So confusing the two, like, there are reasons to perhaps invest in engineering and invest in building a tech team, but it comes at a cost, and that cost, I think, is felt down the road. So if you're a brand and your ambition or your goal is to sell for 25, 50, $100 million, is not going to be based off of, it might be based in part off of like how quickly you're able to like iterate and test and stuff, but the fact that you have a tech team is not going to improve your valuation or your resale value. What it does do is it introduces a lot of potential issues. It introduces issues around technical due diligence. If a brand's acquiring you, whether it's like Colgate or a private equity firm, which is more likely, I suppose, if your stuff is custom built or built on, I'll honestly say, like Headless, like fairly nascent tools, the risks then become, well, what are the maintenance costs? What's the ability of this product to be able to like integrate into our portfolio of brands? What are the costs required to even do proper due diligence to understand what we're acquiring? And because you also know, as a part of that, you're not going to get, you have a bunch of engineers who you're paying $150,000 a year for. So in terms of like your personnel costs, you are skewing towards the most expensive people in a market, except for maybe salespeople. And there won't be automatic maintenance or upgrades of the technology over time. So the counter argument to that, of like the Shopify's, and like where Shopify Plus I think plays into this, is, well, if a brand builds, like, a brand's ability to generate revenue and its margins, and like, it really comes down to, as far as I understand it crudely, audience, LTV, gross margins, contribution margin, supply chain, what, like, all those different things add up to the value of, or what the value is to a potential acquirer, as well as like the segment of the market that they're catering to. And there can be strategic reasons to acquire one of those brands beyond just the financial ones. But if you're acquiring a brand and they're in Shopify or Shopify Plus, then like there is no tech diligence, right? And not only that, like, as a brand who's acquiring it, you're like, oh yeah, this can just fit into our existing portfolio of products. We have a general idea of what the trade-offs will or won't be. We know that it'll continue to benefit from, we'll call it, platform upgrades and innovation by Shopify, whether that's Shop Pay or like changes to the checkout. Now, so it really comes down to, can you get to the point of selling a business for $50 million, $100 million or more being on Shopify? And the answer depends, I think, a bit on the business. It depends a bit on the culture, the founder. Like, because the truth is, like, building software is hard. It's pretty damn hard. And I say this as someone who's built software since I was in the 5th grade. And, like, it's yeah, it's kind of like you're introducing something. I don't like you're introducing something into your home that is very likely to like it might eat all of the cockroaches and mice that are like festering in your home, but there's a very good chance that it's actually in fact going to like destroy your roof. I guess maybe I'm thinking of like something that might eat termites. That would be my analogy. Is
Sure.
like, and so maybe if you're an expert at managing these types of animals, if it's a raccoon you're letting in, if you're like a professional raccoon tamer, then sure, maybe let the raccoon in. But in a lot of situations, it seems like that's probably not the right move. And what I wonder, because my thesis is that you can accomplish a lot, and you can get really, really friggin' far building and scaling a business on Shopify and Shopify Plus if what you do is you invest in custom functionality or boutique functionality in the places that matter. Like the typical argument is, well, I don't want 15 apps I don't want to rely on 15 different apps that may or may not talk to each other to grow my business. I think my go-to in general would be, well, once you get to the place where you can afford to invest in engineering, build a custom app that basically builds the functionality of seven of those apps that are otherwise interconnected, right? Like find the natural interconnectedness of some of these apps and either build integrations yourself, or more likely what can happen is you can build a customer private app that accomplishes a lot of those different things that aren't really integrated properly, and you can do it on top of Shopify's platform, right? Like, so it's not that you have to rely on Shopify's existing app ecosystem. You should be investing in building your own custom apps that solve your own relatively like specific problems. And the truth is that it'll be easier for you to hire engineers for that because you can hire people who are already Shopify experts. You can, there's very specific languages, there's libraries to integrate. Like in my mind, that's almost like the best of both worlds. Now, there are still most definitely some trade-offs of being on a platform like Shopify. That a lot of what's been said has been around like control of the checkout page. A lot of people want a one-page checkout. Shopify is not going to let you have a one-page checkout. So there are and when you upgrade to Shopify Plus, you certainly have a lot more control over the checkout experience. You don't have full control. But so I guess when I think of if I was, I guess I wouldn't be building a brand because I don't know enough about all this other, but like if I was a part, like I've done fractional CTOing for subscription e-commerce brands. That's what I did after CartHook for a bit. In general, I would advise people to get as big as you possibly can on Shopify. And in the event that you get so big and you have so much money that you can afford to pay, several engineers $170,000 a year, or maybe less, depending on your market, then maybe you do that. But I guess I'm not really sold on this idea of all of these trade-offs that people attribute to not building on Shopify. And I think that's a big part of the argument around Headless.
Well, Headless is that like middle ground, right? It's like checkout is owned by Shopify to some extent, and then everything and like the back end, right? Like inventory and all that stuff. From my understanding, like you can use Shopify's tool set to manage that, and then on the front end is all powered by whatever you want it to be powered by. It's that middle ground. I think checkout is something that came up a lot. Is that if you mess that up, in even one line of code that doesn't work on one browser and one like little phone that no one has, that's worth a lot of money at scale. And solving for that without an army of developers, an army of product managers, and like a designer or two, is very hard. So you can cover 80, 90%, 99% of the use case, but that 1% eventually becomes worth a lot of money. It just depends on what scale you're at. And when it becomes worth a lot of money is when you should hire that army I just described. But like, it's not even just engineers, it's a product manager, probably some like UI UX designer to make sure it's working the way you want. So it's like 1, 2, and then maybe 2 or 3 engineers. That's like 5, 6 person team, full time, not cheap each person.
Right.
That problem better be a lot more expensive than that combined salary account.
And sure, I guess that makes more sense than WeWork investing in a wave pool. But there's a bit more relevance to the value creation of the business. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, and I'm sure the truth is somewhere in the middle. And there's not that you were saying anything, not that you were saying the opposite of what I was saying at all. I don't even think we disagree. I think we agree on most of what we just said. I guess.
Like the interesting one is with Headless, right? If you talk about that for a second, I've seen a bunch of case studies from different people that say going Shopify Headless improved conversion rates, and even if it's head to head, the exact same experience. So the difference was the page speed essentially that came from Headless drove a conversion rate increase that was measurable over the equivalent non-headless version.
For Headless in that case, it's just for the marketing pages. It's not Headless for the checkout. Like the checkout.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Checkout. Okay.
Right. In that scenario, the people went headless, and that's a good trade-off, at least from my perspective, right? Conversion rate over everything in many cases. But that now comes with a side effect of they can't use any of the apps that would work on the front end, right? The Shopify apps that let you have flexibility. They have to now custom build anything that's a front end facing app, which can be a lot depending on what you're doing. So that's even in and of itself like a smaller trade-off to make, but you still got to decide, is it worth the increased page speed that comes from going headless and the flexibility of doing everything over like a custom theme, right? That's the alternative.
Yeah, and I mean, and then now what we're just starting to see are these, we'll call it like page builders. I think Builder.io, Shogun has created one. I think when I think of headless, when you say headless, you're thinking of Shopify headless. When I think of headless, I'm thinking of no Shopify at all.
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking of either using, I don't know if Bolt is technically headless. I don't know, but when I think of headless, I think of this, we'll call it ecosystem of multiple products that, you have a page builder, you have a CMS, which would probably be like Contentful or something. You basically have like a suite of independent companies, all of whom focus on a specific portion of the constellation of jobs that need to be done to support a e-commerce business.
Right.
Now, I'd say that the cynic in me is, when you're relying on 12 different products, even if they're like directly integrated, won't you still fall into the problem that people complain about in the Shopify app store of, I have 12 apps, they all kind of do something, none of them necessarily all talk to each other correctly. It's requiring me to have 12 different vendors to like run my business, and it's exhausting because it gets difficult to like debug stuff because everyone starts blaming each other. Now, I think that was my immediate reaction when I started digging into headless. I think the truth is, the argument that I would make against the argument I just made is that with headless, at least you have people specializing in certain aspects of the constellation, for lack of a better expression, where we're not talking about widgets integrating with builders, landing pages. What we're talking about is there are certain pieces or vendors who own specific parts of the stack. And so, for example, like, Rally is a checkout page that integrates with, I believe, Builder. It integrates with the inventory management system. It'll integrate with a bunch of different partners. Um, you know, the responsibility of Rally is to ensure that the checkout is, well, the checkout is always like you were delegating responsibility to one product to provide a kick-ass checkout with all of the, we'll call it post-purchase integrations. That's very different to me than like the pain that people feel around apps. Because part of the problem with apps is that you're also building on top of Shopify. So you as an app developer actually don't have visibility into the foundation of the home. You are simply a veneer. And in
Right.
some cases you have like little holes in the roof that you're able to like stick your little wire into. Um, I do think that in Headless, these brands are able to have much deeper integrations in theory. But you still do have this coordination issue, and you have where people can potentially start blaming each other. And then again, you have it might just come down to you don't want to have in Headless, you don't want to have 15 different vendors. You want maybe three. And from what I understand, Shogun has done a really good job because they're not just creating a landing page; they're doing multiple things related to like the page building. And
Right.
so what ends up happening is it is a benefit because rather than having 7 apps, you have effectively one app, which isn't so different from what I was advocating for within the Shopify place, which was build a custom app that does the job of 5 apps that would otherwise be having to integrate with each other. Because when you have one app, there's fewer places that it's going to um,
Fail.
you'll have fewer points of failure. So I don't know. I guess I've become a bit more bullish on Headless. I guess the bigger questions become at what point are the benefits of truly going headless worth it relative to like does Headless really only make sense for very specific types of brands at specific stages? Will it make sense for more or less any brand that's over $150 million a year in revenue? $1 billion? Like, does it ever make sense for Kylie's store to not be on Shopify Plus? Assuming that it still is.
I mean, it
Um,
probably does right now. I'm just assuming their revenue's out of this world, and if that's the case, they could probably eke out more conversion rate if they went custom and did everything perfect for their experience. Question is if they have that talent to figure out what that would be.
mhm.
Like, if they don't have that talent, then it's definitely downhill, like uphill battle, very unlikely to succeed. If they do, they could probably eke out more revenue because they're definitely getting the top of funnel, they're getting the traffic, they're getting the money out ready to buy customers. They can get an extra 1% of them to convert through some intelligent stuff you couldn't do on Shopify Plus without a whole lot of work, then maybe. But the question is, do they have the person that can figure what those things are? And they might not
Yeah.
have that person on the team. But like a brand that size would probably benefit from it. It would be
Yeah.
the smaller brands that aren't there yet that would have this problem. At least I think.
Yeah, and I guess it comes down to I don't necessarily have a good enough of an idea of we'll call it the financial profile of these companies around what their margins are. Like, does it make sense to have 17 engineers full time on staff? Does it actually lead to a more profitable business on a, you know, versus using vendors? Um, yeah, I don't
It's all
know.
about who you find. I think engineers
Yeah,
versus vendors versus like in-house versus freelancers, it's like that conversation of who you're talking about because there's no like one size fits all where like engineers are always better when they're on the team versus as part of like an external resource. It's not like there's no
yeah,
like linear path there. It's depending on who you find. There's plenty of really bad in-house people, plenty of really bad like outside of the house people. Both ways, like you're not gonna like win just by picking a side.
yeah,
So I don't know. I think what we're coming down to though is like what's the line at which point you hire and what's the minimum hiring to like justify both headless or like custom build the whole thing, right? Like if you're going headless, you probably need what like completely headless, the kind you're talking about, not Shopify headless. You need probably some sort of CTO type person to like manage this whole thing,
hmm
probably an engineer or two under them plus the vendors. And what does that cost? And then to go uh, and what's the incremental improvement in revenue, either recurring revenue on the subscription side, like reduction in churn, or increasing conversion rate at the top of the funnel that you need to justify that increased cost over a customized Shopify Plus experience.
Mm-hmm.
And like you could probably do reverse engineer that math, right? If you can find a way to improve conversion rate by from 1% to 1.5%, that extra 0.5 at a certain revenue scale is worth some amount of money, and then you back into engineers, salaries, average, et cetera, for like a team that will support this to see like what that line is. And like there's probably lines where it's earlier for a brand because either they're solving a problem that you can't solve on Shopify easily. The other thing, I was listening to a podcast the other day, and this investor was talking about he only invests in, I think it was like essentially my understanding was big bet companies. It's like, let's give them, instead of starting with $2 or $5 million, let's give them 100 million so they can hire the best people in the world to do this from day one to increase the odds of success. It's like a different like philosophy than what I've heard in many places. It's like just dump all the money day one so that the odds of success are high.
It's the SoftBank philosophy, which is compete, build moats through money, through cash.
Yeah, but like it's worked,
Yeah.
right? Like there's a bunch of examples of like really successful exits that happen that way. So like that might be the case also for a D2C brand if they're early enough and they need to like don't go the Shopify Plus route and some plugins off the shelf because you're going to just hire the best possible engineers to guarantee success and operate like $100 million brand day one. Like that is a strategy. If it's the strategy I would personally pick, but it's definitely a viable strategy we've seen in the marketplace.
Yeah, interesting. Well, cool. I think so. For anyone listening, Ben and I would be interested in what your thoughts and experiences are, and any PTSD you might have.
Oh, definitely.
Going one direction or another. I think my guess is, I don't know if this is one of those things where it depends. It certainly depends in a lot of cases, but I'd be curious of like, are there any hard and fast rules or like what would be the pros and what would delineate or distinguish going one way or the other, and what are certain situations where you have made that decision and regretted it, and vice versa, or I think it'd be more helpful to speak with more people who have a broader range of experiences, because so much. It's interesting.
It's all about the stories you tell and like what stories you've been a part of. Like I have my set of experiences, you have yours, and I bet some other person has a completely other set of experience that completely obliterate all of ours in terms of like all our viewpoints would not apply to his.
Yep. And then of course there's luck. Sometimes things work positively or negatively, and they shouldn't have for whatever reason. So, well, cool, man. Thanks again for coming on the show. If people want to get in touch with you, learn more about what you're up to, tell the people how to get in touch.
Can find me at ben.bio, ben.bio. Stole that domain a while back. Or on Twitter, B and then my last name, Kochavy, Kochavy. But yeah, awesome. Would love to hear any thoughts from anyone.
Cool. Awesome. Well, you've listened to another episode of Subscription Radio.
The outros get better every time.
Every time.